There we go. Yay, here I am. So thank you very much for the opportunity to have a conversation here today. I think my presentation is probably going to be very different than a lot of the presentations that are on the agenda. I'm not going to cite any of my papers, because I don't have any, but I did write a book. So we do want to make sure that I plug that just to be sure. So one of the things that I want to make clear and to set expectations for this discussion is I'm not going to tell you precisely how to do data governance. What I am going to tell you is the fact that there is a lot of information and there are a lot of experts out there who do want to tell you how to do data governance, and it's most likely not going to work for central banks and national statistical organizations. One of the things that I have found in my work in the private sector, in higher education, and with multiple central banks is, I know you already believe this, but you are different. And so thinking about how your activities need to translate into data governance practices is going to be something that's very key. Let's see, there we go. So here's all the information about me. There's the book. There's my picture. Yay. So the agenda here is we're going to set the stage by talking about what do we actually mean by data governance. Because in a lot of cases, there isn't an actual single definition that works. I actually did write a paper about that, but I didn't cite it. We're going to talk about why it's different for central banks and what you need to think about when you're thinking about trying to implement data governance. And then we're going to talk about how you might be able to do it. And I'm going to try and do all of this in 18 minutes and 19 seconds. So, what is it? So one of the things that if you start to investigate and try to learn about how to do data governance or what it is, you're going to find out that not everybody agrees. And so here's 3 different definitions from very knowledgeable practitioners and experts in the data governance area that don't always align. And they especially don't always align with the kinds of activities that go on in central banks and statistical organizations. There is a theme going through here, though, that I think resonates with a lot of the conversations that we've heard so far. We talk about formal management of data. We can talk about authority and control, right? All of the conversations around trust and making sure that we know who's doing what. And then the whole notion of responsibilities and accountabilities. So at the core of data governance activities is really this notion of decision rights. Who's allowed to say yes, who's allowed to say no? And what is the scope of those permissions and the appropriate use for these data? I'm indebted to the OECD opening presentation and some of the other AI conversations yesterday for already saying this is one of the reasons why you need data management, why you need data governance, because I didn't have time, I had to cut those slides out. So you already know that if you want to do AI, you have to do data governance. Let's talk about how we might do that. One thing to keep in mind is what data governance is not. A lot of places in the corporate world implement data governance because they did something wrong. They had a breach, somebody exposed something they weren't supposed to, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore, one of the #1 reasons that private organizations do data governance is because they have to fix something. It's about compliance and risk management. I'm very excited to have seen so many presentations talking about the opportunities that go with data, and I'm here to tell you that data governance helps you to advance those opportunities by making sure that you do have the appropriate things in place. It's not about technology. In a lot of organizations, there is this inability to separate the data from the platform where it resides, and those decisions around those 2 things need to be considered separately. Data can't work without IT, but data needs to be governed separately from IT. And then the 3rd point is to make sure, this is the key if you take away nothing else today, is data governance is not one size fits all. So you'll see a lot of recommendations that talk about the way to do data governance, and that just isn't a thing, especially in organizations where you're taking in data from external sources and using it for research and things that are not necessarily production-oriented activities. So what does it look like? If you go out and Google, every single consultant, expert, data governance book has some version of a pyramid. We all have pyramids. I stole this one from IBM because they were kind enough to do it badly. You'll see there's a set of levels. There is strategic conversations that have to happen. There is tactical activities that have to go on. There's operational things that need to be done. Okay? We're going to talk in a few minutes about how these things look very different in central banks than they do in private organizations. Okay, so this is a general idea of what data governance looks like. What does it cover? What is the scope? Again, not only does every data governance practitioner have a triangle, they also have a house. So go into Google Images and type data governance house, and you'll find 15 versions of this. This is the one I use in my course where I teach data governance and ethics. And there's a couple key points that I want to make sure everybody is paying attention to. Data governance is the roof that keeps everything together. But as we've already talked about, underlying this, the technology is important, right? Data governance has to be built on that. The processes are important, okay? And support services. I think that the keynote earlier talked about the support for AI and data use, really important. The ethos, or what is out in the atmosphere that makes data governance function, is the people and the places where you need to engage the people who are in part of your data governance work. Education and training. I think we had at least 2 presentations yesterday that talked about literacy. And again, the Bank of Portugal and their literacy program, really important. Data governance needs to be part of that if you want it to be effective. Because change management in any organization is key. One of the fundamental truths about data governance is if you do it right, it will involve someone doing something differently than they used to do it. And guess what? People hate change. It doesn't matter how good you tell them it's going to be. It means that something in their life is going to feel harder, it's going to be more complicated, and you need to address those things head on or it will be a problem. Oops, I went the wrong way. Let me see if I can do this again. There we go. So where we start to have this dichotomy between the way that corporate America, corporate Chile, corporate Europe works is when we talk about what data are in scope for a data governance program. For the rest of the world, outside of governments and central banks, this is a moot point. All of the data that they manage are data that come from internal business processes. They're the data that they use to run their organizations. They have complete control over the collection, the definition, the management of those data assets. Okay, these are what's known as enterprise data, and there are conferences every single week of the year all over the world. I could never be in my office if I wanted to go to a conference because there's hundreds of them. Central banks, statistical organizations also have these enterprise data. You hire people, so you have got HR records. You pay people, you have finance statements. But what you have that most commercial organizations don't is data that you bring in from either other organizations, from constituents, from other sources that are crucial to the outputs that you do. Now, some commercial organizations are also going to bring in data from other places, but they're still doing it with the eye to improving their business practices or improving their bottom line. That's not why you bring it in. You bring it in because that's the key to your existence, the key to your functioning. And so therefore, most of the data governance practitioners that are out there and the books that you will read don't talk about this at all because it's not part of their equation. So now I've given you a little bit of a taste of where the dichotomy comes from. Let's talk a little bit about where the differences are going to surface and the things that you need to pay attention to. And this gets to our one-size-fits-all notion. So we get to this different data. We've talked about that just a tiny bit, but where it really becomes problematic is the fact that all of the recommendations for doing good data governance, I'm sorry, I do a lot with the air quotes, because most of this is just garbage. With doing good data governance is really trying to figure out what are the pieces that need to be in place. Okay, so when we start talking about the control, we start talking about the definitions, we start talking about permitted uses, right? The Bank of Portugal talked about being able to share, right? That sounds like it should be easy except for the part where it might not be. And if you're a commercial organization, they talk about being able to pry it out of owners' hands, and we're going to talk about what a data owner is. But the kinds of data that we deal with in the central banking and national statistic world has very different rules and very different aspects that need to be dealt with. Another difference is the difference of people. So I'm indebted to previous presentations for making all of these points for me. I probably don't need to say this, but the whole concept of who has the decision rights is key, right? Data governance practitioners and experts will talk about data owners as being the ones that get to make the decisions. Who owns the data that you get from another agency? In the Bank of Portugal, who owns the Social Security data internally? It's a concept that just doesn't translate well. And so therefore, even figuring out what the roles and responsibilities for your data governance program is going to be different than what would be recommended for Toyota, Coca-Cola, fill in your favorite corporate entity. And then there's the concept of different domains. The reason this is important is because the triangle that we talked about, you'll always be recommended that the top strategic piece of that structure have individuals who represent different domains. And that context for the corporate world is someone from the HR domain, someone from the finance domain, someone from the sales domain, someone from the marketing domain. We don't have that. Central banks don't have that. And so just the conversation about how do we organize the data, right? We have catalogs, we can do this. What does that look like? If you don't have data librarians, you desperately need them. So the idea here is, how do we talk about the organization of information? We spent a lot of time yesterday talking about national accounts. What's the domain for that, right? The data governance world for enterprise data doesn't understand that at all. And then there's different challenges. Data quality is one of my favorite examples. We've heard talk about it several times during the course of this conference. But guess what? Data quality is almost always one of the drivers in the enterprise data world for doing data governance, because they want to have that single definition of wage. They want to have that single definition of employee. But guess what? They're allowed to make the definition whatever they want. So therefore, they can trace data quality challenges back to the source. If somebody is entering wage data into their human resources system and they do it wrong, they can fix that. If you get data from the Social Security Administration, from your tax records, that has an error, you don't get to fix that. So even the conversation around data quality looks very different, because you're not going to be talking about data quality frameworks or data quality improvements. You're going to be talking about data quality assessments. And that's, again, something that most of the corporate and enterprise data governance practitioners don't really appreciate. And then there's the motivation. Data governance out in the wild is all about the ROI. It's all about increasing your customer base. Sometimes it's about decreasing costs. It's about increasing profits, increasing sales. How do we increase the customer base for a central bank? It's a nonsensical idea. So the issue is, what's the return on investment for data governance in a central bank? We don't have those same metrics. We used to joke when I worked at the Fed that ROI didn't stand for return on investment. It stood for risk of incarceration, because our metric tends to be, let's not be on the front page of the paper. The reputational risk that's been mentioned. It's very, very difficult to quantify that. Okay, so without the notion of a profit motive, it's really hard to have the conversations around change management, for example, that needs to happen in order for the practitioners to really be on board. All right, so now that you're all depressed because you're never ever going to be able to do data governance with the stuff that's out on the internet, now I'm going to tell you what you can do, because I'm all about making you cheerful. The information that's out there is not bad. You just have to be aware that it's not always applicable, and you need to figure out how to adapt it so that it does work for you. So data governance is still important. I don't want to give the impression that just because we're not talking about making profits, that we don't need data governance. We already heard yesterday, you can't do AI without good data governance, right? So therefore, somebody already made the argument for me. You'll notice that the roof and the foundation of our house are the same. We've got the same information challenges with the people involved, but now we're going to start talking about differences in our pillars, differences in the components that we have for data governance. So if you had scrutinized very closely my blue and orange house, you would have noticed that there was a data quality adjustment or data quality framework here. Now we're talking about assessment, right? There's going to be policies and guidelines and sometimes standards, but sometimes it's really difficult to figure out how to implement the concept of a standard when you're trying to match things across wages. How do we define a standard definition for wages? How is it we can have that conversation when we're talking about data from lots of different places, okay? So you may need to revise the pillars that you're actually working with. And align the incentives. I'm glad you mentioned my economics degree because I am 100% about incentives. I usually make all kinds of jokes about what's in your utility function, and this is the place where that is key. One of the things that I have seen with the organizations that I have worked with is that they don't appreciate the fact that the change management piece is really key for the people that work with these data. Now, I think that national statistical organizations and central banks are ahead of the curve in that there is the tradition of data stewardship that we heard about in yesterday's keynote. So there is that notion that we do need to be good custodians of the information that we have. However, it still means that somebody wants to write a paper about something and they know that these data live someplace, and so maybe if they don't ask and they just write it, it'll all work out okay. I'm not speaking of experience. I am making fun of economists because I am one and I've worked with them for a long time, and really getting that cool paper out is a lot of what gets them excited in the morning. So data governance is often seen as punitive, right? We have to do something different because of a breach, because of something else, right? We need to make sure that people understand the focus on the opportunity piece. Talk about enablement. Talk about what you are now able to do if you have well-governed data that you couldn't do otherwise. The resonation of the trust that has been through so many of these presentations, this is exactly where that aligns, right? You want trust in the central bank. You want trust in the work that the staff does. And more importantly, you want to make sure that people understand that just because they're doing something different doesn't mean they can't get benefit out of it. Without KPIs or sales goals or revenue targets, the important thing is to make sure the people who are practicing data governance see it in terms that they understand. If we have well-governed data with good permissions processes, reviews where necessary, understanding privacy protection so that the work can be disseminated more broadly, then you get better audiences for your papers. You are able to use more time to do the research rather than finding the data that you need, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to couch it in terms of what the individuals need, because trust me, the well-being for your organization is not in an individual's utility function. Address their concerns, right? Don't pretend that just because it's better for everyone, that it's going to be something that people are willing to just hop on board with. So it's really important to make sure that the change management, the conversations happen. And then find community. You're not alone. Especially this transition to AI and the world of more data than we know what to do with. Sometimes we do know, sometimes we don't. Everyone is struggling. Central banks, private organizations, higher education, other governments, agencies, everyone is trying to figure out how to do this. Figure it out together. If you are a central bank that is trying to work on how to do data governance and you don't know about the group that is meeting in Washington, D.C. next week, the Central Bank Data Collaboration Group, talk to me. You need to be part of that. And don't believe that I'm the only one that can save you, although I do believe I'm the only one that can save you, but go out and read all of the things, attend the other conferences, but keep in mind the places where there's differences. Realize that when they start talking about the 360-degree view of customer, which they will, it doesn't apply to you, and that's fine. And then find some inner zen, right? Understand that data governance will never be done. It's a program, not a project. It will take far longer than you expect it to. It will take far more resources than you want. But if you take small steps in the right direction, baby steps, you will get there and you will be able to reap the benefits of using AI, getting your trust, having all of the stuff that you are interested in having and moving your organization and the economy forward. And there I'm done. I did it in 20 minutes. Yay.